G'day fellas. Before the video really gets started, I want to address a couple things. One, I haven't uploaded in 9 months. Whoops. Just about 200 people have subscribed to me since then, and though that is really awesome, I feel like I've let just about every single one of them down. So, I hope you remember why you subscribed to me. Sorry. I hope you thought that the bullshit streams for the past 9 months were entertaining enough. I hope you like this one. And the second thing I wanted to address is the first half of this video, or something around that, is going to look really, really bad. I recorded most of the scene build at a really low bitrate, because that was what my streaming settings were on OBS. So just try to put up with the absolute bullshit quality. It does eventually get better, and it captures like the best moments of the scene build, so you're not going to miss too much due to the shit quality. But please be patient with me. I'm a retard. I'm sorry. This one is inspired by Plasmo's post-apocalyptic Pripyat 1/72nd scale diorama. I absolutely fell in love with the look of the house, how the corrugated metal was falling off and the underlying structure was exposed, and how everything was so weathered and worn. The textures were beautiful, and I really enjoy Russian village architecture, and I've been wanting to try custom building a house for a while. A lot of the initial part of this scene build is focused on converting this old wooden village house from like the 1920s into something a little more time appropriate for Chernobyl. I'll be doing a lot of work replacing the walls with concrete or plaster or a material akin to that, and I spend a long amount of time working on the roof, the support structure underneath, mainly to accommodate for the spaces in between the sheet metal. But before all that, of course, I'm laying out the initial stages of it. I'm placing down my base for the house, which also includes this little outcropping. And the outcropping is going to be the piece that I start experimenting with the ideas that I have in mind, and it's going to be the first part that I work on. I end up placing down the basic geometry props with textures inside where the wall pieces are, and sort of overlapping them on top of the wooden pieces. And then once I was happy with how they were looking, I started fitting them into the spaces that I wanted the plaster walls to be. I used the bone tool for this, which was half a pain and half not. It doesn't change the collisions, but because it's all slider based, I can see what it's changing in real time, and I'm able to get the size really good. And then once everything was flush fit and sitting nice and snug, I welded all the pieces together and then placed it on top of my base structure. Welding weighted props to effects really is unstable. It gets all wibbly, and it's highly likely that the objects would just spaz out entirely, so I was really careful doing this. After that, I was looking at ways to edit the roof, and initially I tried submaterialing it, but because of the structure underneath, it wasn't going to work, so I ended up just cutting off the roof entirely, which I didn't do for the outcropping, because the outcropping had a different structure underneath the wooden thing, so I was just able to use the submaterial tool to make it invisible. And after this, I started placing down my support structure. Same thing as the plaster walls earlier, using the bone tool to make their size more appropriate, and then just using these props to make a frame for the roof. I put a lot of care into this because from the beginning, I knew that I was going to have holes in the roof, and I wanted the house's skeleton in a way to be visible. I edited a lot of this down. Trust me when I say this took a really long time to do. That being said, it was still a lot of fun, and the end result is amazing. These are staying untextured for now because when I made them wooden initially and tried working with them, they became really hard to see and make out against their background. And on top of that, the grid texture that they come default with was really useful for measuring out the spaces between my planks, so it became really easy to make them all look perfectly spaced out. And here, doing the support structure for the outcropping featured smaller ones and a lot denser pieces, so I ended up placing down a one horizontal one and one vertical one to make it easier to put them all down faster. Again, this took way longer than it looked, but from the camera viewport, the effort is completely worth it. This effect looks really nice. A couple planks on the left side were missing, so I added them in pretty quick and then made moves on the walls of the main structure. The walls of the main structure were a little bit more interesting because the main structure had a bunch of different shapes that I needed to viz clip props to fit properly. So, you know, here I'm clipping this prop to fit the contours of the roof and then clipping its sides in just to make it fit the wall more snug. Then I started working on the props around the door frame and the window on the front of the house. The one on the left was standard procedure, just placing a prop down and then fitting it with the bone tool. The ones around the window I thought would be a lot more challenging than they were. Initially I didn't think I was going to be able to place the props inside each other. I thought that would create texture issues, which is why I run a test render. But it looked pretty fine, so I ended up placing all these down, viz clipping them, and it just worked. And yeah, here's the bit where I run the test render. I use a really high radius lamp and then set the focal point on the house just so I can get a lot of coverage on one place while still getting really nice shadows. And yeah, it revealed to me that the textures were doing fine, so after this I viz clipped it and made it all fit right, and then it was good to go. And now I start dressing the scene. I had this little chicken coop which has a really nice sheet metal roof that comes into play later. And then this sign that says chapel in French, which I end up changing to Russian in Photoshop. And this really nice blue ornamental window, which is meant to be from Greece, but I thought it fit the Russian style really well. And then I spawned down this shelter that shares the same sheet metal as the chicken coop, and I viz clip it all down to isolate just the metal. I give it a little bit of grime using the material tool, and then I start placing it onto the roof. I add this volcanic rocks base texture as a detail texture, which works wonders in making things look weathered without doing anything in Photoshop. And then begins the lengthy process of layering all of these pieces of metal on top of the roof. I wanted to give it a very uneven look, like it's been absolutely torn up by storms and weather, all sorts of wind, and just completely neglected. So a lot of it's going to be really irregular, with bits sticking out and of course the holes in it. A sort of side effect of the VizClip tool is that the clips don't move, and you can edit something's bones without it changing where it's clipped, which comes in handy here because I can translate and move the base bone on this sheet metal to change up the pattern and the length of it, which really comes in handy to help give everything a lot of variation on top of the roof and make it not look like it's a bunch of duplicates of the same piece. Here I'm adding the edges of the roof on the top here just to give it a little bit of extra shape, and I flip over the ones on the left to hide the wood, and a couple on the right just to add a little bit of more definition, and then some pieces on the ground that have fallen off. And then I start looking at the textures, changing the textures a little bit, and finalizing the look of the house, adding textures to the beams. And then I end up making the wood on the trimmings lighter, because I didn't like how harsh the contrast was between the plaster and the wooden frame, and lighter colors are also easier to edit in Photoshop. And here I run a test render just to bring out any flaws, and most of it looks really good, so I start cleaning up the scene and then working on details. I start throwing in some fences on the left, where I viz clip one, and on the right here, and then I add a little trough in the front yard. But it's starting to trouble me how empty the left side of the house is. And I'm looking at all these reference images, and all of these houses are really beautifully colored. They have these really rich, vibrant greens and yellows and all that, and I wanted to try and do that. So I ended up recoloring the panels green, and then I made the tough decision to clip the entire left side of the building off, and then custom build my own wall with its own trimmings and its own set of windows. To make the spaces for the windows, the wall had to be split up into multiple segments, and ended up consisting of about 5 different pieces. The top piece being the one that fit to the roof, and then 3 in the middle to fill the spaces between the windows, and then a larger one at the bottom to fill the rest. I play around with the textures of the frame a little bit, and end up settling on the plaster one, but a white version instead of green, to really bring out the shapes of the left side and give it a lot of detail. Then I made the frame a little bit thinner to be more consistent with the images that I was looking at, and to help differentiate it from the wooden frame a little bit more. And then I start detailing the scene more, adding in a car and some more objects around the house, like some troughs and clotheslines, and this little sign that says Feldpost, which I plan on in Photoshop to change to something like welcome or home. Before getting too stuck into the scene dressing, I realized that I hadn't touched the base plate at all, so I gave the edge a solid color, and then I went and I gave the middle a dirt texture. I started throwing this rock piece in a bunch of different places just to detail the ground a bit more, add some surface variation to some key points. There was this large piece that was overlapping, but I ended up viz clipping this out, so it wasn't too much of a problem. And then I clean up the overhanging parts, and then dress up the scene a little bit more. I add some barrels to the left side, and then I start doing the vines. The vines really helped sell the look that this was overgrown, and their 3D effect made the shadows really interesting, and made the contours and the shapes of the house look absolutely stunning. I was placing them mostly in the lower areas, but as I got further in, I started making them creep through the sheet metal at the top. I cannot overstate how fantastic these vines really pulled the scene all together. They were perfect for adding just that extra bit of vegetation without drowning it in like massive ferns. And because I wanted to keep the clarity of the house shape, this was really important. Back to ground detail now. I'm throwing in a bunch of scattered rocks and some branches on the ground, as I planned on adding a big tree. The rocks really helped with the realism of the ground. They added a lot of really interesting shapes to the surface area. Now I start kicking the detail into overdrive. I'm adding some grass, these little flower groups here, and then this tree. The tree is amazing because it adds so much to the contours of the scene, as well as a really nice area of interesting shadows, which helps to break up the lighting really well. And because the tree's there, I also added a bunch of fallen leaves, mainly on the roof of the house and the car, but as well as along the ground underneath it. I placed a lot of focus on these smaller details as I wanted to make this scene as realistic as possible. The diorama structure is great because it allows me to pack so much detail into such a small area, and I don't have to worry about detailing an entire scene build, so I'm able to focus a lot harder on one spot. Here I'm really throwing in the final touches on the scene. I'm adding this little cobble path and then some small grass terrain, just to throw in a little bit more color in the area, and then I run a test render. And the test render is just to check if there's any seams, if there's any wrong parts, and everything's working great. So now I just clean up the scene and then begin properly rendering. I do my renders in 4 main stages. The first render is always the sun render, which is mainly just key light and shadows. And the second one is a softer version of the sun render, just to diffuse the lighting a bit. The third render is the sky ambience, which I just color blue. And then the fourth is the light bounce, but I don't show it here because the light bounce render would have taken 30 minutes, so I end up doing that later. And what you're seeing here is my isolation passes. The isolation passes they basically just act as masks for the textures later, which you'll see pop up soon. For the weathering, I chose a dark grime to give the base weathering, and then some moss for obvious reasons, and finally a dirt texture, which also I attempted to couple up as rust, but that didn't really end up working out. And now we hit the Photoshop phase. All the initial stuff is pretty boring. I'm just layering on the light renders, and then setting up folders and organizing those folders and giving the folders their respective masks, which you see. Once the folder structure was set up and I had all the masks in place, before doing anything else, I went back into the game and got myself a Z-depth mask, because knowing that the light bounce render would take 36 minutes, I decided to get everything I needed before running the render, so that way I could work on the scene in Photoshop while everything's going on, instead of having to wait that whole time. The Z-depth makes it really easy to select things based on their depth in the scene, which really comes in handy in the atmospheric dust phase, which is way at the end. It also helps diffuse some of the colors and give the scene an implied sense of depth. It's also at this time that I start making moves on editing the signs. I started with the feld post one, which, funny little side effect, I tried getting the F to go away and it changed it into a perfect P, which I thought was way too hilarious, so I focused on that for a while. And I ended up replacing the text with Glavnaya, which means house. I initially wanted it to mean welcome, but in the context of a sign at the front of a house, it ended up being this really long phrase that I wasn't able to fit on it. Then I moved on to the chapel sign, which was far easier. The direct translation was just Chesovnia, and I threw that on and gave it the correct perspective, and then it was fine. I also had to make sure that I got the blending right, because fitting it on is one thing, but making it look like it's on the sign is another. So I fiddle around with that for a while. Enough about the signs, it's time for the really interesting part. Here I'm going through the different blending modes on the textures, and then I start painting them on using the masks. This part is really fun. I had a really good time experimenting with how to get all of these different surface properties down. I ended up staying with a technique that was using a softer brush to lay down like a base coat of dirt, and then adding a more stippled, harder brush over the top to give it some harder variation and random bits of detail. I spend a lot of time getting the blending right, really going over initially and then going back with a softer razor and making sure the effect is really nice and smooth, which all helps with the realism of the piece. Then I start hitting it with the moss. My technique was to start much harder down where the vines are, and then work my way up and make it more transparent and more soft as it goes further up the place. So you'll see me really building up the effect around where the vines are gathered, and then really smoothing it out as it graduates upwards. I end up traveling between these effects a fair few times. Now I'm hitting it with the dirt textures on the roof. I try to build up the effect along the edges of the segments, as well as in the little crevices and spaces where you would think that grime would build up. The aim was just to make it look more weathered than it was. I spent a good while trying to get this right. I wanted the whole thing to be tinted a kind of brown, as if it's been hit by rain and all sorts of dust over the years, but I also wanted the effects to be built up properly, with that good base. So as it continues, you'll see me erasing and going over and erasing, and then adding and building more and more in different spots. Once I was happy with the roof bits, I start going over on the little side parts. I didn't plan on doing this initially, but the more I worked on it, the stranger it looked that the wooden frame didn't have any kind of moss on it. So I went over with the same technique I did on the wall parts, just building it up from the bottom to the top, gradually making it softer as it goes further up, as well as random patches on the higher up parts, just to give it a bit of variation and make the higher parts not look as clean as they were. Once the main focus of the image had all the detail that it needed, I started moving on to the smaller parts, such as the car. The car followed the same general structure as the house did, overlaying the initial grime texture, and then some dirt, and then some moss. I tried to make the car look much more like it was faded and rusty, but the underlying texture really wasn't allowing this, and I couldn't find any blending modes that properly facilitated any kind of effect such as this. So I ended up settling with a much more basic, everything's very dirty and weathered kind of look. Once I'm settled with the car, and the 36-minute light bounce render finishes, I end up going back to the roof and copying a part of its dirt texture and pasting it over the sign. I didn't like how clean the sign was, and it was drawing a lot of attention to the middle of the image because of how bright it was, and I really wanted to diffuse this and make it look like it fit more with the scene. So I followed a much more basic version of the texturing process, just putting it over, masking it, and then just painting on little bits here and there, stippling the effect on. The texturing process is getting pretty close to done here. I'm just finalizing the different parts of the scene. I throw some textures on the tree trunk just to make it look a little bit more weathered and look like it's been lived on. No, not lived on. It's really lived there for a long time. There we go. And then it started troubling me that the roof didn't have any kind of moss on it. So I ended up taking a render of the moss texture in the game and then throwing it over and then drawing it on and blending it just to give it a little bit of a green tint, as well as some more focused mossy areas. Once all that was said and done, I ended up moving on to some smaller details of the scene, really just fixing up small areas that were bugging me, such as smoothing out the shadow on the bottom here, and painting on shadows like a fucking moron. I mean, I was trying to make it look like the leaves weren't floating because the shadows were kind of fucky, but don't do this. Don't paint shadows. No one can paint shadows. Please don't. I ended up making moves on color correction a little bit, but before I went any further, I weathered the text on the sign because I didn't like how it was just basic and the way it was. Then I did a little bit of streaking grime effects on the left side of the house, which my initial tries were pretty fucking dreadful. So I ended up trying a different technique where I stippled on bits of weathering and then motion blurred it, and that worked far better. In fact, I was so happy with this effect that I put it nowhere else on the scene. Now comes the part in every single scene I've ever made where I use those goddamn powder brushes to do some fucking dust effects. I used the Z depth to select and erase parts of the dust effect so that way it sits at the correct position in the scene. Close enough. Fuck you, we're using that. And then I tried creating a gold ray effect by using some dirty brush and then motion blurring it and putting it in the mask. It took a bit of tweaking to get right, but it did end up selling the look that I was going for. To finalize the effect, I did a whole bunch of opacity tweaking and shifting the effect around and making sure that everything looked pretty natural. And once the right side was done, I just threw on some effects on the left side and then I got to color correction. I ended up going through about like 50 different filters trying to find one that I wanted, and I cut most of them out because it would have taken ages. But I ended up settling on a pretty mild one and then making it more milder. It just boosted the lights and made the darks a little bit cooler. And then of course to break the pacing, I edit the dust effect a little bit on the right. and then we're like done. It's like done and good. Fuck yeah! Now that the video is over, I want to say a couple things. Again, sorry for the 9-month space between uploads. But I also want to say a huge thank you to all the people that are like subscribing and watching my shit. It is really, really cool that the stuff that I'm putting out is getting any kind of attention at all. I'm happy to be sharing these things with people, and I really hope that people are learning something from this. Also, please give feedback in the comments about this style of video. I'm still trying to find my editing style, and it's really difficult to figure out what I want to do with these videos. So any kind of feedback, constructive or not, tell me to go fuck myself in the comments, just go for it. And with that all being said, thank you, I love you, see you in the next one. In 9 months.
On my Uberfest Gaming, Gmod videos by brothers for brothers. Sponsored by Windows Gangster Edition.
Hey, stop shooting me, Soichio!
Hauptmann, Hauptmann, gut SS Model.